Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the FSMA Food Safety Updates for Produce Growers webinar. We are very pleased to have Kaylee Feiereisel from Community Alliance with Family Farmers and Leanna Kelly from FDA with us this afternoon. We will get to their presentation shortly, but first I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items. And just to let you know, we're going to turn video off during the presentations, but we'll come back online during the question and answer sessions, just so that you know that there are humans behind the voices in the PowerPoint slides. So my name is Megan Donovan. I will be your host today. I'm a program specialist at the CCOF Foundation. The CCOF Foundation advances organic agriculture for a healthy world through education and hardship grants, technical assistance, and consumer education. Behind the scenes today, we have Larissa Hernandez, who is the CCOF Foundation's program assistant. She'll be providing technical assistance and will be the one responding to questions when you write them in. And she might jump on as an alternative host if any technical issues arise. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a grant from the California Specialty Crops Small and Medium Scale Farm Food Safety Technical Assistance Program, which is made possible by the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily reflect the official views of the USDA. And also note this webinar is not providing legal advice. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And finally, a quick Zoom tutorial. I'm sure you all are super Zoom experts at this point, but just in case, here are a few tips. To see the Zoom controls, wiggle your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you are in full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit Full Screen Mode. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or to communicate with the webinar staff, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Write your question or comments in the field at the bottom of the box and click Send. If you would like to send your question anonymously, check the Send Anonymously box on the left. And note, we won't be using the chat function for this webinar. So if you need to communicate with Larissa or send in any comments or questions, just use the question and answer box. And feel free to send in questions at any time. We'll kind of collect those throughout the webinar and address them during the question and answer breaks. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our webinar evaluation survey will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions. As a final reminder, the first half of today's webinar is being recorded. The second half of the webinar featuring FDA's presentation will be only presented live. And after the webinar, we will send out a link to the first half recording, as well as a PDF of both presenters' slides. And also, we had a huge number of people sign up for this webinar. I think almost 200 people signed up. So we have a pretty large crowd. We're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as we can. And just want to apologize in advance if we can't get to your specific question and encourage you to follow up after the webinar with those additional questions. So we'd like to have you just test out the question and answer box. Write in, let us know where you're calling in from today and what crops you grow. And we'll loop back around to that information later in the webinar. But yes, we are pleased to have everyone with us today. And With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Kaylee Feiereisel serves as CAFF's Farmer Services Director. She provides food safety technical assistance to farmers as they further develop their practices to meet new requirements. In addition to being an organic farmer, Kaylee studied food safety, local food systems, and food and agriculture policy while completing her graduate degree in public health nutrition from the University of California, Berkeley. So Kaylee, thanks so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on our food safety webinars. And I will kind of give you control of the presentation.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks everyone for taking some time today to join us for this webinar on the Food Safety Modernization Act and specifically the Produce Safety Rule. We're going to have a split presentation here. I'll take about half of the time here to talk about some elements of this topic, and then I'm going to hand it over to our FDA presenter, Leanna, and she's going to talk about more details. So I work for an organization called Community Alliance with Family Farmers, or CAFF. And if you're not familiar, we're a statewide nonprofit based in California that's supported family farmers for over 40 years with a variety of different on-the-ground programs and services, one of which is food safety technical assistance. So myself and a couple other staff at CAFF have been providing food safety assistance to farmers for over a decade now, and we realize that food safety is a really complicated topic, especially for smaller and middle-sized farmers, that you have maybe unique needs, and organic farmers that at first glance, like figuring out how the regulation applies to your farm, it might not be clear right away. So hopefully this webinar can help provide some more answers than new questions for you. And let me just start here to take us away. So I'm actually gonna have Megan pop a poll up here and get a sense from the audience of answering this question. Do you have a clear understanding of what a farm that needs to be in full compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act, Produce Safety Rule must do to meet the Produce Safety Rule water requirements? So specifically for your farm, do you know what you need to do to be in compliance with the water requirements? I'll just wait a second here to give you a second to reread that and answer there. Megan, I'll, when you see on your end that it should be closed, feel free to close it. Great. So we've got a good spread here of about 20% know what you need to do as far as water tests and by when. About 70% you have a sense that you need to take water tests, but it's still a little murky as to when and how many, and some have no idea. That's great. And hopefully we'll have some more people in the first category at the end of this webinar. So we'll continue here. I just want to give a preface that try not to get overwhelmed with the details that we're going to be covering. There's going to be a number of different resources mentioned here on our website at CAFF.org with CCOF, with FDA. There's going to be a number of links that will be dropped into the chat box as well. So first, if anyone is new to FSMA or the Food Safety Modernization Act, and specifically the Produce Safety Rule part of it, a little bit of history is that in 2011, President Obama signed it into law, and then it took a number of years until November 2015 for the Food and Drug Administration to actually write the different parts of the law. So there's 7 main rules or kind of sections to the law that cover different parts of the supply chain. from all the way from farm and field level to transportation companies, to companies importing food, to even animal food. But the two main rules that apply at the farm level are the produce safety rule, or the produce rule, and the preventative controls rule may apply to some farms, specifically if they're more of a facility and or like a food hub type situation. Today, we're going to be focused on the produce rule, or the produce safety rule, and specifically the water part of that rule. Then from 2017 to 19, there was this really big push for education and like figuring out how this regulation was actually going to be implemented and how inspections were going to happen on the ground and whatnot. And then from spring 2019 and onward, official regulation and enforcement and inspections began. But fortunately, the approach of educational enforcement has been taken so that while farmers and everyone is still trying to figure out exactly what this huge new, not so much new anymore, this huge federal law means for farmers at the farm level. So another comment to make about FSMA is that it's not prescriptive, and there's an example here from some text of the law that mentions some phrases like reasonably necessary and necessary and appropriate, which for farmers can be slightly frustrating because you're just, just tell me like how many feet should that be, like the distance from where that feces was or whatnot, or how do I deal with XYZ scenario? And it's actually a good thing that the law is not prescriptive in a lot of ways, because it allows you to assess the unique risks at your farm and in your scenarios that you see for food safety related issues on your farm, and to allow you to respond in the most appropriate ways for those scenarios. So I'm going to do a mini recap, a really high level overview in case it looked like a lot of people had a sense of whether their farm needed to be in full compliance with the law or not from the start of this. But in case you're not sure, there's 3 categories that farms fall under FSMA, and some farms are considered fully exempt from the law. The second category is what's called qualified exempt farms or partially exempt farms. And then the third category would be farms that need to be in full compliance with the law. So I'm going to do a brief overview of the different criteria farms need to meet to fall into each of these 3 categories. So first, farms that are fully exempt, those are farms that meet the criteria shown on the screen. So if you're a farm growing produce only for personal or on-farm consumption, no matter what crops, how many acres or what types you're growing, that farm would be considered fully exempt. If you only grow produce that is on the rarely consumed raw list by FDA, which we have linked to, then no matter how many acres or how many dollars that you sell of, say, eggplants, which is on that list, that farm would be considered fully exempt. Also, if you only grow produce that goes through a kill step, which would be something like taking fresh tomatoes and pasteurizing them into, or canning them into a canned tomato sauce, or growing grapes that are fermented and made into wine, things like that. Those are considered kill steps. Those farms would be fully exempt. Or if your farm has a total annual gross produce sales of less than $28,075, that farm is considered too small for the law and considered exempt. But please note that's only produce sales, and it uses this FDA inflation adjusted table for the different financial thresholds, which are based on the last 3 years of sales averaged together and then compared to the inflation table. So if you might be considering that as the criteria that your farm might meet, please look into that with more specific or in more detail, because it's a little bit more detailed than what I'm showing here on this slide. So the second category of farms that are considered qualified exempt, these farms must meet 2 conditions. The first is to have less than $561,494 in annual gross food sales, and sell the majority of food directly to customers, which the law defines as qualified end users. So some examples of a qualified end user could be customers at a farmer's market, directly to one restaurant, directly to one grocery store, people that buy a community supported agriculture or CSA program, Those are some examples, but these sales must be within the same state or 275 miles from the farm. And again, that financial threshold uses the 3-year adjusted average. So that is a very brief overview of the 2 criteria that qualified exempt farms must meet. And then the third category of farms, what the law calls fully covered farms, or farms that need to be in full compliance with the law. These are basically all the other farms that don't fit into the first 2 categories. So if a farm has a 3-year adjusted gross food sales greater than $561,494, the law considers that farm too big. So even if you're a farm that has $1 million in gross sales and you sell entirely through farmers markets, you only go to farmers markets, that's all you do, you are considered too big by the law and your farm needs to be in full compliance. The second group of farms that need to be in full compliance are farms that sell less than that $500,000 number, but they do not sell at least 50.1% of their sales to qualified end users. So say you have $100,000 in gross sales of strawberries, but you sell all of those berries directly to a distributor that sells them around the country, then that farm would need to be in full compliance because you would not meet the 50.1% of sales to qualified end user because 100% of the sales were to a distributor. So I realized that was a pretty brief overview of the 3 categories. From the poll at the beginning, it seems like most people know where their farm stands on that note. So I'm going to continue and just want to point out on this table here that kind of breaks down a timeline of important dates for the different size farms based on annual sales. There's been a tiered timeline of when compliance dates have occurred. And so FSMA compliance dates have all passed. Inspection dates have all passed or are here now. And then on this far right-hand column, that's what is related to what we're going to talk about during most of the rest of this presentation about the water requirements within FSMA's produce safety rule for farms. And as you can see there, the timeline for when farms need to be in compliance with the water requirements is still in front of us. And that is important to realize and then think about as far as how you're going to get your farm into compliance. Additionally, I should note that when we initially scheduled this webinar, we were hoping that there would be new guidance released by the FDA about the water requirements because they're currently re-reviewing those, and that has not been released yet. So because we don't have any new guidance or new information on the water details, we're going to review what currently is required. And I'm sure Leanna will make some additional comments on this in her part of the presentation. So just another overview for farms that are considered fully covered under the produce safety rule part of FSMA. There's a number of different topical areas where practices and or records need to be kept so that the farm is in compliance with the law. As you can see here, they're listed on this slide, but there's different worker training and qualifications, certain things for health and hygiene, for soil amendments, for tools, equipment, sanitation, for post-harvest activities. For example, there at the top, you see that the Produce Safety Alliance or the PSA grower training is one example that is under the training or qualifications. So that is currently the only FDA approved training that at least one person from the farm needs to attend if the farm needs to be in full compliance with the law. We'll have a link on a later slide and in the chat box that links to the website that lists any of the upcoming trainings for this for that training. So any of the upcoming dates and times for that training. So you could register for that if you are interested in doing that. So as the slide says, the bottom line here is that on-farm food safety, especially for small or medium-sized farms and or organic farms, is a process and you can't make all these changes overnight. So it's important to start now if you haven't already. And you are starting out by being on this webinar and taking time to learn about this information or get a refresher on this information so it's clear to you what you need to do. So as this slide says, at the very bottom, we have a bullet point on water. And now we're going to transition into recapping some of the water requirements that are currently in the law for farms that need to be in full compliance. So there's two different types of water in terms of thinking about this. There's production water that you use when you irrigate and or apply fertilizers or chemicals, different things like that. And then there's post-harvest water. So first I'm going to talk about, as the slide header says, production water. So you're using production water to irrigate your crops. Some farms use groundwater sources such as a well to do that. If you're using a well, then you would need to, as is posted here on the slide, to take 4 initial tests over a period of a year for generic E. coli to create your initial baseline water profile. And then annually thereafter, at least 1 water test for each source. So if you're using 2 or 3 different wells on your farm, you'll need to be doing this 4 baseline tests and then 1 annual test for each of those different well sources. And in addition, you'll need to take an annual or do an annual inspection of your water system on your farm. You know, walking any above ground irrigation lines, checking well heads, backflow devices, things like that, to just make sure there's no visible and clear problems with any equipment that could be causing any irrigation or water contamination possibilities. And then for production water that is a surface water source, such as an irrigation ditch or canal, or maybe you have a holding pond or a reservoir on your farm where you store water before it's piped out and applied to the field, you similarly need to do an annual inspection of the water system on your farm. And then because this is surface water, as the law currently stands, you would need to do an initial baseline of 20 tests over a period of 2 to 4 years to establish that baseline for that pond or irrigation canal. And then annually thereafter, take at least 5 tests for each water source. And those tests are for generic E. coli and a number that's out of a 100 milliliter sample. So additionally, for your production water, sometimes farms, you might come back with, get those test results back and find out that your water is above the allowable range for production water for the number of generic E. coli. So you might have to do water treatment. And if you're doing that, then you would need to make sure you're documenting what you're doing and when. Another thing is with the second bullet called microbial die-off rate. So if your water tests come back and again, the number is higher than is allowed for use during production and irrigating crops as they're growing, then there is the possibility that you could use the microbial die-off rate, which is determined by putting your water test results into a formula, and then it will tell you if you could wait 1, 2, 3, or 4 days after your last irrigation before harvesting from that area, because research has shown that a certain number of days, if depending upon the quality of your water, if you can wait 1 day after the last irrigation and then harvest, and then any potential contamination that was there, research has shown would have decayed enough to be a safe limit. So that's basically that can go up to 4 days after the last irrigation. I know in California and probably elsewhere, waiting 4 days after the last irrigation before harvest, it might not be feasible, but if you are somewhere where that is where it's feasible to wait a certain number of days and use the microbial die-off rate, that might be an approach you want to take. So there's a fact sheet here and there's more information. I'm doing a very high level overview of that now, but there's a lot more specifics to that you could learn more about. And then the last point on this slide is to document the corrective measures taken if water doesn't initially meet requirements. So that's production water. Then when we're talking about post-harvest water, which would be the water you use during harvest and or post-harvest washing, packing, any water you use to make ice, if you use ice to do any packing of product, and as well as water used for hand washing, this water must have 0 generic E. coli in that 100 milliliter sample. And the law requires that you test that water 4 or more times during the growing season to create that initial baseline, and then at least one test per year thereafter. If you're using city water for post-harvest water uses, then they are testing that themselves, and it's important for you to keep a copy or have a link to where you can access a copy of those water tests online. If you're using a sanitizer product in post-harvest wash water, for example, if you have like a big dunk tank of water that you put a sanitizer into the water, you must make sure that that sanitizer is labeled for the way you're using it. So if you're using it to spray down equipment, to sanitize equipment, it must be labeled for that. That would be like to be used on food contact surfaces, and more than that, like a spray on them. So it's important to make sure to use sanitizer products in the way that they're labeled. And specifically for organic farmers and growers, it's important to make sure that you check with your certifier before using any sanitizer products to avoid any non-compliances. There are definitely sanitizer products that are allowed under organic certification out there, but not every product is. So it's important to make sure you are using a product that is allowed for organic if you are an organic farmer. And then lastly, I wanted to make a point to announce that if you're not aware of it right now, CAFF is running a food safety cost share program through the end of March. So we're coming up on about a week to go for this. And it is a possibility for you to acquire some funding to help offset the costs for water tests at your property and or third-party audit costs. There's a link here, and then I'll also be dropping it in the chat box. We have English and Spanish applications that are on our website. And yeah, like it says here, you can get up to $250 a farm for water tests. So if you haven't started those water tests that I mentioned, or you are considering doing water tests, or you have recently done water tests, the cost share application is for reimbursement for costs that you incurred in the recent past, or for payment and then going out and doing the tests in the near future. So there's a lot more information on that there, but in the interest of time, I'll continue and we'll post the link. So here's some other resources. Like I mentioned, the Produce Safety Alliance grower training and some other links to webinars and the National Food Safety Clearinghouse. Like Megan mentioned, you'll be getting a PDF of these slides emailed to you in the post-webinar email, so you'll have these resources available. So thanks everyone, and I'll turn it over to Megan if there's any questions.
Great, thanks, Kaylee. That was a great overview of the different compliance categories as well as the water requirements. And we have had a number of questions that have come in during the presentation. So some of them are just sort of clarifying questions related to compliance. Someone was wondering whether raisins are considered produce and would be subject to the produce safety rule.
I believe so, but Liana, please jump in if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty certain they are.
Great, thanks. And then someone was also wondering for gross food sales, if that includes only human foods, or will animal feed be included in the gross food sales calculation?
The latter, that it's human and animal food, it's all food. So I know that that's certainly becoming an issue in some of the Midwest states where some farms grow, a lot of corn or soy products for animal feed and maybe a little bit of produce. And if it's all under the same business entity, it is also includes the animal feed as well.
Great, thanks. And then someone was also wondering whether a CSA is considered a qualified end user.
Yep, a community-supported agriculture program, or a CSA, is an example of a sales to a qualified end user.
Thanks. And then we also got some questions on the water rules. Someone was wondering, who needs to comply with those rules? If you could just reiterate that again, if it's only for larger farms, or if you had a small kind of like home operation, if you would be subject to the water rules.
Yeah, so I went over that pretty fast in the beginning, but how there's 3 different categories of farms that fall under the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule. So if your farm was in that fully exempt category, then the water requirements don't apply. And if your farm was in the qualified exempt or partially exempt category, the water requirements don't apply. Per se, like they're not required. I would say that, any farm of any size needs to be aware of their water quality to help reduce food safety issues, but only the farms that are in the full compliance category, the over $561,000 and or the under that financial threshold, but you do not sell the majority to qualified end users. Those farms in the full compliance category have the water requirements that they must be in compliance with.
Great, thanks for that clarification. And then we had a number of questions sort of about different water testing scenarios. And I know you touched on this in terms of post-harvest handling water. But if an operation uses water that comes out of a water district, and maybe you could speak to an irrigation water district, can they use their reports that cover the E. coli tests?
Yeah, I actually do not know the answer to this. I would say that I don't know where those tests are being taken, at what point along the distribution system are those tests happening. And my intuition is that you would want to still be taking those tests right at the exit point of the irrigation system or the irrigation canal that you're getting the water from. But I feel free, Leanna, or someone else, if you want to correct me on that one.
Okay, thanks. And then another question was wondering how do you test natural spring water that you put into a storage tank?
So it's not a groundwater source because it's a spring at the surface of the of land. And then you're keeping it in a storage tank. I would encourage that person to use my email right there and contact me directly, because I'd want to know a little bit more about the process of what's happening there. You're going to need some testing, but to say exactly what the answer is right now, I don't feel like I have enough information.
Great, thanks. And then there's another question kind of on the definition of agriculture water. Relative to water testing of ditch water, does it matter if the production water does not contact the harvested product? For example, summer squash grown atop plastic mulch with irrigation, the drip tape buried underneath.
Right. So, yeah, like I mentioned, there's the whole Produce Safety Alliance grower training, a long 8-hour training. This is like just a very quick snapshot of the water requirements. And so that training or talking to somebody in more in depth about this is really what's needed if you're new to this information. But at the top level for agricultural water requirements under FSMA, there's a definition of what is agricultural water, and that is getting right to this question that this person is asking. So agricultural water is water that it touches the edible portion of the crop. So the example is often given like using micro or furrow irrigation or micro sprinklers in an orchard of, say, citrus fruit, where those oranges are up in the tree. that the law would not consider that water considered agricultural water because of the distance from where the water is and how contained in those like micro sprinklers it's being, you know, irrigated onto the base of those trees with the fruit many feet away from that water. So that scenario with summer squash on plastic and drip tape, I feel like that is less of a clear example between, is this agricultural water or is this not? So, you know, is that farm only growing squash? Are they growing other crops that get that water on the edible portion of the crop? If so, then they have to do that water testing for the other crops already. So I don't know if, again, this is probably a scenario where they could just email and we could talk more about the specifics. Yeah, maybe I'll pause there in the interest of time.
Okay, great, thanks. So I think in interest of time, we're gonna wrap up questions for Kaylee now, but at the end of the presentations, we'll have another question and answer session. So we'll hope to get to some of the more of the ones that were answered. And if you have other questions that come up during Leanna's presentation, feel free to go ahead and write those in as well. So Kaylee, thanks again for your presentation and your quick overview of a very complex topic. And also thank you for being willing to, you know, check in with folks after the webinar about their specific situations. So with that, I'm gonna move on to our next